in Bihar from the 1960s. The food movement, the students have...
I think this full auditorium expresses my own pleasure at chairing this session at which Sumanta Banerjee will deliver a public lecture on the core and contours of popular movements in India in the coming future. Sumanta.
Thank you, Sumanta.
I will take 2 minutes to introduce you. Though Sumanta Banerjee needs no introduction, and the cliche could not have been more appropriate in his case than in many others that it is used, nevertheless, I will not deny myself the privilege of performing this little ritual. Sumanta Banerjee, journalist, worked in the Statesman, better known as a political activist, has been member or been associated with the CPI, the CPIM, the CPIML. He was a columnist of the well-known EPW. For a long time, a civil rights activist, one of the leaders of PUDR. He was also one of the founders of the Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy. However, the majority of people in this room, including myself, know him for his 3 books that could be called cult books. No historian can do any work on the colonial period without Parlor and the Street and Dangerous Outcasts. His book also, In the Wake of Naxalbari, has had enormous influence on scholarship of that period. Friends, I give you Sumanta Banerjee.
Well, Samita, I'm overwhelmed by the compliments, but more importantly, I feel proud to be here in Jadavpur University, where its students launched one of the first popular movements in the Indian campus scene, Hoke Colorado. Its significance lies in their taking up an issue that is usually neglected in the mainstream political movements, the gender issue. It was in protest against the administration's indifference to the complaint of molestation of a girl student and the demand for the punishment of the culprits. The rest of the story is known to you all, and I don't have to repeat it. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Coming to the present topic, I think there is a need to distinguish between the nature of political movements on the one hand and popular movements on the other. Political movements are generally hegemonic, led by political parties with specific objectives that are oriented by their respective ideologies and shifting strategies. At times, leaders of such political movements can compromise their basic ideological commitments and frame instead a political strategy that would suit their immediate interests. They thus sacrifice the original demands of their supporters from among the masses who brought them to positions of power as their representatives. There is a need, therefore, again, to discuss the complex relationship between ideological commitment and realpolitik. Popular movements, on the other hand, spring from spontaneous groundswelling of discontent at local levels, like instances which are quite frequent, like people, blocking the national highway in the neighborhood in protest against police inaction, or the violent resistance by slum dwellers when their shacks are bulldozed by the administration on the plea that they have encroached on public land, while the administration escapes its responsibility to provide shelter to these people. Or in protest by villagers against the flooding of their homes by the Narmada Dam or the anti-POSCO agitation. These protests initially started as visceral manifestations of anger against the local police, the civic administrators, the contractors, and other such agents who were encroaching upon their lands and ousting them in the name of development projects. But they gradually developed into organized movements led not by the mainstream political parties, but by members from their own communities, organic leaders in the Gramscian sense, like you're familiar here in West Bengal, Chhatradhar Mahado in Lalgarh in West Bengal. Some of these movements have come under the umbrella of the National Alliance of Popular Movements, where social activists from outside, like Medha Patkar, have of course played a major role in mobilizing public support and fighting their issues in the courts. Popular movements of this nature have been an alternative stream of public protests running parallel to political movements led by mainstream national or state political parties. At the same time, we should remember that at times sections of mainstream political leadership and those of popular movements converge mainly over three issues. One, public demands for basic needs like land, food, shelter, medical facilities, education, and democratic rights. Two, public opposition to the state's demand from the citizens to obey its coercive laws. And three, public protests by villagers against their ouster from their lands by the state in the interest of industrialization and other development projects. All these three issues at various times have interlocked with each other in the public domain of political as well as popular movements in our history. But the relationship between the organized political and the spontaneous popular had always been fraught with tensions. And here I would like to give a sort of historical perspective of the past before coming to the present. To recall the past, the Gandhi-led Congress Party attempted to unite the maximum number of the Indian people behind its political objectives, which changed from time to time. It organized political movements which passed through various phases, from the non-cooperation movement of 1921-22 to demand for dominion status in 1928, to the civil disobedience movement of 1930-31, to the Quit India movement in 1942. And as we see the various stages progressing gradually from protests against the colonial administration and boycott of British goods in the earlier phase, then the next phase to the demand for full independence. But during certain periods, stages of this history, there has been a disjuncture between the interests of the mainstream political leaders at the top and the local grievances of certain sections of the population at the bottom. Public explosions of such popular grievances often took violent forms, the most well-known illustration of which was the Chauri Chaura incident of February 5, 1922, in Gorakhpur district of the then United Provinces, when angry peasants burnt alive notorious policemen who oppressed them. There is a disconnect between the public mood of utter despair and impatience with legalities which shapes popular movements on the one hand, and the negotiable interest of the elite leadership willing to compromise with ruling powers for a few concessions which shape political movements on the other. The tensions between the two was best demonstrated after the Chauri Chaura incident. Gandhi realized that he had been riding a tiger that he could not control, and in abject surrender to the colonial administrators, he called off the non-cooperation movement. The parallel streams to the mainstream national political movement were a number of class-based, tribal, and caste-based and region-based popular movements. The national political, mainly Congress leadership, even during their anti-colonial agitation and later after independence, never cared to accommodate the demands of these poorer classes, the Dalit, tribal, and regional minorities, in their agenda of socio-economic transformation. From among the Dalit leadership, Ambedkar was the only one to challenge Gandhi's Hinduistic hegemony over national politics. The sources of the parallel popular movements of the present times could be traced back to the long tradition of tribal rebellions and peasant jacqueries that took place in the late 18th and 19th century period, directed both against the British colonial administrators and their Indian agents and the traditional indigenous feudal exploiters. The rebellions like the Santal and Munda uprising in East India, the Girijan insurgencies in the hill and forest areas of South India, and the peasant revolts in Bengal, led by a combination of Sannasi, Faraizi, Wahhabi armed opposition to their enemies. These were provoked by certain policies of the colonial administration. But let me quote in this connection the very in-depth analysis of the roots of these tribal rebellions was made by the famous historian Sumit Sarkar. To quote him, within quotes, British rule and its accompanying commercialization strengthened already present tendencies towards penetration of tribal areas by outsiders from the plains, like moneylenders, traders, land grabbers, and contractors, and attempts were made to monopolize forest wealth through curbs on use of timber and grazing facilities, unquote. Remember, Sumit was writing this book way back in 1983, based on his findings relating to his research in 19th century India. It is more than 30 years ago, and yet, today, the causes of popular resistance in tribal areas of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar, West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and Maharashtra, among other states, can still be traced to the same factors that provoked tribal rebellions more than 100 years ago. To quote again, the penetration of tribal areas by moneylenders, traders, land grabbers, and contractors, and attempts to monopolize forest wealth. Do we not see a replication of this in the present Indian state's model of development based on the commercialization of forest resources, encouragement of land mafia and contractors to threaten or seduce farmers to let go of their lands for industrial projects? If I raise such questions, I may be accused of sedition. The all-catch provision in our colonial penal code, neither the Congress nor the BJP-led government, despite their pretensions to nationalism, dared to eliminate this notorious clause from the penal code, which demonstrate their opportunist utilization of colonial codes to suppress dissent. The main manifestation of popular movements that ran parallel and often opposed to the mainstream Congress-led political movements in the pre-independence area was to be found in two streams. One, class-based, stemming from the grievances of the industrial labor and rural peasantry, and the other, caste and tribal-based, which we describe today as identity politics, which protested against economic exploitation and social discrimination by the upper castes. The class-based agitations took the form of long drawn-out strikes in jute mills in Bengal, by railway workers in different parts of India, and demonstrations by poor and landless peasants against exploitation by landlords in the rural areas. These agitations were often led by fledgling leftist groups like the communist-oriented. In those days, the Communist Party of India hadn't yet been formed. the communist-oriented workers' and peasants' parties from the late 1920s onwards, and the socialists within the Congress Party. But the official Congress leadership opposed such popular movements. Like Gandhi opposed the Ahmedabad industrial workers' strike, or later in 1937, the Congress provincial government suppressed the no-rent campaigns by peasantry in Bihar and North India. As for the second stream of caste and tribal-based popular movements, the 1920s saw the emergence of a number of agitations by the depressed castes who belonged to the Dalit, as well as middle castes in the Hindu caste hierarchy, like the Jadavs. They took various forms. In Bihar, they demanded improvement of their social status and refused menial and other services to their landlords. In Maharashtra, the Dalit Mahars demanded the right to use common tanks and enter temples, and abolition of the traditional system of Mahars compelled to offer services to upper caste village chiefs. In Tamil Nadu, the self-respect movement founded by Periyar, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, encouraged Dalits to forcibly enter temples and even burn copies of the Manusmriti. As indicated earlier, tensions between the mainstream political parties and the popular movements can be traced to the divergence of priorities of the two respective formations. These divergences are aggravated by the system of electoral politics that we have inherited from the British colonial regime. Once elected to power, the erstwhile opposition political parties will jolly well have to conform to the rules of the Constitution. For their leaders, it is no longer obligatory or necessary to organize mass movements, since they believe that the demands of the masses will be met by the administrative measures that they announce. But history has demonstrated how such policies have failed in practice at the ground level in India due to pressures from feudal landlords and commercial interests, acting through the local bureaucrats. In the late 1930s, the Congress and other political parties were seduced through the electoral process. This came after the 1935 Reformed Acts, to enjoy limited powers of governance in provinces, where they formed governments in 1937 in Bihar, United Provinces, Orissa, and Madras. But in these provinces, which they administered, whenever the peasants came out in demonstrations, demanding a fair share of their harvest, or right over their lands, or end to overtaxation, among other things, the Congress ministries imposed Section 144 and employed police pickets to throttle these protests. In April 1938, Nehru in fact advised the Kisans of Allahabad not to obstruct the smooth working of the Congress ministry. In September, in the same year, the All India Congress Committee adopted a resolution denouncing such peasants' agitations as class war. Now, don't these acts and declarations of the Congress leaders and ministers of the late 1930s sound like anticipatory premonitions of the behavior of the left leaders and ministries in West Bengal in the late 1960s? In fact, I still remember Hare Krishna Konar, great peasant leader, in 1967, when after the first elections, the United Front had come to power. I was a reporter in Delhi, and Hare Krishna Konar had come to Delhi. And Hare Krishna Konar was a very militant, aggressive peasant leader, led movements to occupy lands. So I asked him, what's going to happen to the peasants' movement? So he said, well, look here, for the moment it has to be postponed. And then he admitted that, when a fruit is kept under the shade of a tree, it refuses to grow. So, that was the metaphor he used for the future of the peasant movement under government protection. The police suppression of rural unrest in Naxalbar in 1967 and later in Shingur, Nandigram, Lalgarh in the 2000s are echoes of the past. The Trinamool Congress government has been following in the same footsteps. As an anti-left government opposition political party, it hijacked during the left front government. Trinamool hijacked a popular movement in Lalgarh and co-opted it into its own political agenda to serve its immediate electoral interests, just as the Congress as an opposition party did in the pre-independence era, and the left as an opposition in the post-independence days. Sumanta Banerjee won the votes of the Lalgarh tribals by supporting their popular movement for reclamation of their lands and ensuring the release of their leaders. But once coming to power, like any governing political party, the Trinamool government has pursued the same repressive policies. What followed her coming to power in West Bengal was the killing of Kishanji, the Maoist leader who initially organized the movement and supported Mamata during her electoral campaign, and the continuing detention of popular movement leaders like Chatradhar Mahadev and his followers. So what we find is the political parties, once in power, how they come out of sync with the popular needs, like indifference to the daily grievances of the people. Now, in this connection, I would like to refer very briefly to one movement which hasn't yet been touched till now, the slum movement, which is a very strong movement in West Bengal, in other areas also. And it has a long tradition. In fact, right from the colonial days, the slum dwellers fight for right on their own shacks. And two of the most famous slum movements was one in Beleghata, in Bagbazar area, and the other in Kakulia Basti in South Calcutta. Now, these were again popular grievances which came up, They built shacks and police came, the administrators used to come and throw them out. And their spontaneous resistance came to be led later by the Communist Party. So I think along with the movements which we have discovered, which we have discussed till now, women's movement, the food movement, tram movement, the slum movement had been a continuous movement, So I think it deserves a place when we talk about movements. Anyway, given this history of the morphing of opposition political parties into representatives of the ruling establishment who ultimately betray the people, various disgruntled sections of the masses are seeking new avenues of protest. Now coming to the modern phase. They are mainly micro-level regional movements on local demands, like the anti-dam agitations or resistance by villagers against forcible acquirement of their lands for industrial projects, or by forest dwellers against mining in their localities. As mentioned earlier, some of these agitations have joined the National Alliance of People's Movement, which, through both constitutional means, like legal battles, as well as mass demonstrations, are trying to pressurize the state, whether under the previous Congress-led UP regime or the present BJP-ruled government. They're pressurizing them to reverse the model of development, protect the rural poor from encroachment on their lands, and change the existing laws to prevent such encroachment. But the support base of NAPM is still dispersed, confined only to a few regional popular movements and local grievances, like the anti-non-mother dam or anti-POSCO. But what is important right now is that outside the NAPM, new tactics of popular resistance are emerging in different parts of the country. And the leaders of these new movements are emerging from within the communities, organic intellectuals. To give an example, During the recent widespread incidents of the Sangh Parivar-led attacks on Dalits and Muslims, accusing them of transporting and skinning dead cows, in Gujarat, which is Modi's headquarters, the 35-year-old Dalit Gujarati lawyer and social activist named Jignesh Mevani resorted to the innovative tactics of urging Dalits to refuse cow carcasses from their neighborhoods and dump them in front of the municipality offices. This can pose a formidable challenge to the BJP-led municipalities, which have to protect their urban voters from the stink of dead cows. But this is what the BJP deserves. If the Sangh Parivar members claim to be worshippers of Gomata, cow as their mother, why don't they take care of the dead body of a cow? Cremate her accompanied with the usual Hindu rites, rituals, instead of leaving her to be skinned by the infidel Muslims and Dalits. Why don't they take Shoshane giye goru puriye shraddho karo? The popular movements of the Dalit communities are taking a radical form, departing from the rules of their established political parties, like Mayawati's BSP or the Republican Party. A new generation of Dalit students in universities are forging alliances with the left, as we witnessed in the University of Hyderabad, following the suicide of the Dalit student Rohit Vemula. In the JNU in Delhi, although they did not join the Left Front, which won the Students' Union elections there recently, these Ambedkar Phule Association, trying to bring together Adivasi and Dalits, as the name suggests, Ambedkar Phule, finished second for the post of President of the Union. In this connection, we should note the developments in campus politics, where a new generation of students are emerging as leaders of popular movements. A typical representative is Kanhaiya Kumar, the former president of the JNU Students' Union, who, although a member of the CPI, went beyond the brief and in his speeches gave a new meaning to the term Azadi, meaning freedom from oppression and a repressive state. No wonder it resonated with the sentiments of the Kashmiri students in JNU, who joined him in raising the slogan, a demonstration which earned the wrath of the Modi government, leading to Kanhaiya's arrest. Leaders like Kanhaiya in students' movements or Jignesh Mevani in the Dalit agitation are emerging as organic intellectuals from among their own communities. Also, the other thing, which again in the first session today should have been mentioned, the women's new trends emerging in the women's movements. For instance, on social and socio-religious issues like the right to enter Sabarmali temple, or more importantly, Muslim women getting together against triple talaq. Now, these may seem to be religious demonstrations, but they are symbolic, assertion of rights in the guise of religious rights, but assertion of gender rights. So I think these are very important issues, new movements, which have to be taken into consideration by theoreticians in the women movement. Now let me come to both the opportunities and limitations of such movements. The possibilities of success of these various movements. First, the core of these movements lies in their power to sensitize large sections of the public to the grievances of the hitherto neglected sections of the unorganized poor, as exemplified by the demonstrations of civil society members in protest against the Left Front government's suppression of the peasants' agitations in Nandigram, Singur, Lalgarh, or in support of the movement of the ousties of the Narmada Dam in Maharashtra. You see, when citizens coming together, holding demonstrations. These movements have to a certain extent also acted as catalytic agents in pressurizing the state to enact laws to protect the underprivileged, as the law to ensure the rights of forest dwellers, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme under the UPA regime, and also in persuading the judiciary at times to haul up the state for violation of human rights. Thus, such popular movements play a major role in forming the political consciousness of civil society and influencing the policies of the state at certain appropriate moments of history. But at the same time, let's be cautious about the limitations of these popular movements. They are confined only to local and regional demands, whether retention of land or traditional rights to forest in the rural countryside, or defense of intellectual independence in universities and academic institutions in the urban areas. These popular movements, which are taking place in the heartland of India, have failed to empathize with the other popular movements which are exploding in the marginal edges of Indian society, like Kashmir, Northeast. Has there been any meeting in Calcutta? I don't know, I want to be enlightened. In support of Iram Sharmila, who had been on hunger strike for several years, which she had withdrawn recently, demanding the withdrawal of the Draconian Armed Forces Special Powers Act from her home state, Manipur. Under this act, the armed forces enjoy impunity against punishment for any act that they might commit when killing innocent citizens on the plea of fighting terrorism. Since we in West Bengal are privileged enough to be outside the scope of this act, should we remain indifferent to the plight of the Manipuri people? Shouldn't we organize a popular movement demanding the scrapping of the AFSPA, which in law incidentally is a criminal law enacted by the British administration and reinforced by the Congress government? Or take the case of Kashmir. Shouldn't we, Kolkata's civil society and its intellectuals, come out in demonstrations condemning the blinding of Kashmiri youth by pellet bullets by Indian security forces? And yet, in the 1960s, Kolkata's youth came out in the streets expressing solidarity with the Vietnamese freedom struggle by coining the slogan, Tomar Naam, Amar Naam, Vietnam. Demonstration of solidarity with their own people, Manipuris, Kashmiris, the Adivasis of Chhattisgarh. It is, and also, for instance, before that, there are certain other disquieting features in these ethnic movements, which makes it difficult for others to totally identify and support them. Like, in Manipur, for instance, there is an anti-Meitei edge among the tribals. In the Northeast, conflicts between Nagas and Kukis, Meiteis and Nagas, Thankul Nagas and Hars. So, the division within the ethnic communities also is an obstruction, is a sort of a hurdle in the way of solidarity movement. So I'm also trying to draw your attention to the difficulties. It is this disjuncture between the priorities of different political movements that hinder their potentialities to emerge as a united, decisive force in Indian politics. The popular movements in India today are separated from each other by local, regional, ethnic, linguistic, and various sectional interests. Such isolated popular movements based purely on their sectarian interests cannot resist for long the centralized forces of the Indian state, which, in the name of national security, can clamp down upon them. Unless they align with similar popular movements in other parts of India, including those led by the people of Manipur, Nagaland, Kashmir, these popular movements taking place now will remain confined to their own territories in their areas. In other words, there is a need of an all-India alliance of these different popular movements, which can pressurize both the mainstream political parties and the ruling powers to address to their various grievances. There's a need for a long-term project of constructing a popular alliance built on ideological consensus. It can't be just, temporary alliances. At the same time, a sound of warning. Such an alliance of popular movement should not be under the hegemony of any of the present mainstream political parties, which shift their priorities according to their electoral and sectarian interests. But the alliance or solidarity movement must be underpinned by an ideology that is committed to the following values. 1, equitable distribution of resources and income. 2, social justice. 3, democracy within their organization as well as outside. This is important because some of these popular movements, they are individual based, and authoritarianism develops within these movements. 4, spirit of rational thinking and scientific inquiry that should aim at destroying orthodox superstitious beliefs and practices that are being revived and reinforced by the ministers of the present government at the center. Now, this assumes importance. A need for a popular movement on this particular issue assumes importance. As you know, the 3 rationalists who have been killed during the last 2 years, Narendra Dhavalkar, Govind Bansare, M.M. Kalburgi. And so there is here is an issue around which there is a need for a popular movement, a spirit of rational thinking and scientific inquiry. And 5th, which I very strongly feel, the need to actively resist the violence unleashed by the muscle men of these ministers against religious minorities, the need for self-defense squads to protect meetings, which are being, like ABVP goons, raiding meetings, vandalizing exhibitions. There's the need to set up self-protest groups to resist them. And this, I don't know, people will not agree, but I would like to recall Gandhi's words. I don't have that quotation here, but I have written about it. You see, 1944, during the war, the British soldiers often used to go to stations and attack the common, those who used to sell fruits and other things. And so these porters and others, they resisted the British soldiers. And so Gandhi's disciples, they came and said that, Bapuji, this shouldn't be done. There should be peaceful resistance. So Gandhi came out with the words that, Gandhi came out with the words that do resist them. They should be resisted, the British soldiers, when they are looting. Non-violence is the best means. But if that fails, use violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumanta, for that very masterly look at popular movements over a very long period of time. I will not attempt a summary of this wide-ranging lecture, just 2 or 3 things to respond to that paper. Your rhetorical question on why today's youth do not come out in solidarity in metropolitan centers for movements happening elsewhere in the country. In this very room, there may be students of this university who did that a few months ago and risked arrest and a month and a half long of battle between the university and other political parties in the city. It is no longer so simple. this might reflect a generational change too. You have seen opposition to the state in much more draconian ways than actually we have. We have grown up with a far more accommodative space for movement, space for articulating opposition. And those halcyon days are going, if not gone. We live in very tumultuous times, to borrow the term from a very different context. And these tumultuous times, I think this project, this workshop, and your talk today in many ways reflect a refocusing of our concerns and indeed of our academic work too, given that about 2 decades long of very different kind of focus, culture, for instance, as a term, has changed the way we look at politics and has changed it in a way that will not allow us to return to the old definition of politics. Nevertheless, I think today most people in this room would agree that a refocusing on the political has become a sense of urgency about doing that. I particularly found your last reference to rationality interesting in the context of the death of the killing of the rationalists. Because rationality in most of our academic work has become a far more problematic term than it was 20, 30 years ago. And today the opposition to reason is not only orthodox superstition. It is a very real world which is a public sphere that is so affect-drenched that the opposition to reason is emotion. And popular movements are, of course, about emotion as much as they are about reason. And this, I think, is a new opposition that politics has to deal with, has to engage with. Even as the state becomes much less accommodative, not only of a variety of interests, but as well as any kind of opposition. The second thing I took away from this lecture is how important it is not to be locked in presentist debates and presentist arguments, that of course in every point in time our present concerns move us or influences us in our historical endeavors. So it may be a very appropriate time to return to many of the questions of politics that we have abandoned in many ways, even in our historical scholarship for the last 20 years. The third thing I take away from your talk, we have spoken of the popular in many registers through the day today and the half day yesterday. In the last talk, Mithilesh, for instance, talked about the mass in relation to the popular. You are adding the political. And it seems to me that it actually is very important to do that, to look at the many ways in which the political inflects the popular, not only as you did in opposition to it, but now because politics is such a grander term, so much more stretched term, it would be interesting to look at the many ways in which the political can play, if you like, in terms of categories to the popular. And it seems to me as though there are like 4 at least elements in this: popular, the popular, the political, the left, which has been the framing argument for much of our discussions today. But what you bring in is our presentist concern about new categories. And the new categories are no longer compassable or even comprehensible by the left. So the two categories, Dalit and women, Dalit much more in the scene today, women like a distant horizon that may or may not erupt into the popular, much more difficult for women as a category to erupt into the popular. Also, Dalit is a constitutional, so Dalit is much more closely tied with political in the narrow sense. It is connected with reservation, it's connected with electoral politics in ways that women is not and cannot be. We have seen the failure of any attempt at reservation for women at the level of the Constitution. And I think that should refocus our attention to the ways in which Dalit and women are very different categories, cannot be encompassed within the similar notion either of the popular or of the political. And those are questions, I think, for us today. And those are the questions of which we have to write histories. So therefore, I would thank Sumanta for drawing our attention to these very, very urgent questions, questions that can feed very valuably back into the project for which this workshop has been undertaken. I will stop there. I will ask Snehashish to, in fact, thank the many people we need to thank for this 1.5-day workshop.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shomita-di. We would at first like to thank the audience who have been very patient and very participative in the whole 2-day workshop. We would like to thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for their support and the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, and especially Professor Shomita Sen for her cooperation. We would like to thank all the chairs and the discussants. We would especially grateful to Sumanta Banerjee on agreeing to deliver the public lecture. We are thankful to Elena Sen, Indu Agnihotri, Panchali Roy, and Monlarika Sinha Roy on holding the panel yesterday. We are grateful to CRG's administration staff and especially to Professor Paulo Banerjee, who is quite unwell at this particular time, but we all wish her a very speedy recovery. And all those staff who are in logistical arrangement at the Jadavpur University. And we hope to find you in the future programs of Calcutta Research Group. And thank you all once again for being there in the program. Thank you.